It's always fascinating to really dig into the past, right? To try and uncover the real story behind historical figures, especially when you can kind of cut through the dense academic stuff.
Absolutely. It's like peeling back layers.
That's exactly the kind of intellectual adventure we're diving into today.
In the material you've gathered, it takes us straight into one of history's most, well, enduring puzzles. The search for the historical Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
And what's really compelling, I think, isn't just Jesus himself, but this long, winding road of inquiry, how people have tried to understand him over centuries.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is basically to map out these different ways scholars have tackled the question. We'll trace it from way back all the way up to the more contemporary perspectives, particularly the work of Fernando Bermejo-Rubio.
Yeah, and it's really important to remember, as the sources highlight, that piecing together a definitive picture, well, it's a unique challenge.
How so?
The direct historical evidence, archaeological traces, they're surprisingly thin. As one scholar famously put it, he was essentially a marginal figure in a marginal province.
Wow, marginal.
Yeah, and that scarcity of direct firsthand evidence, it's crucial. It's the backdrop to this whole centuries-long discussion we're going to explore.
Okay, so let's jump right in. There's this common idea, right, that the serious historical look at Jesus really kicked off with the Enlightenment, specifically with Ray Morris.
Right, that's the popular narrative.
But Bermejo-Rubio, and the material confirms this, he argues that actually this quest goes back much, much earlier.
It really does. And what's fascinating is that even in, late antiquity and within early Jewish thought, you already find people asking critical questions, offering different takes on the Jesus story.
Not modern history methods, obviously, but still critical thinking.
Exactly. They were using the tools they had, logic, interpretation, to grapple with the figure presented in those emerging Christian texts.
Like Celso, back in the 2nd century. He wasn't just dismissing it, was he? He was actually analyzing the Gospels.
He really was, using logic and hermeneutics, basically interpretation.
What was one of his main points?
Well, one key thing Celso questioned was, if Jesus was truly divine, why didn't he make that crystal clear to everyone, especially his enemies? Why reveal it mainly to his followers?
Ah, I see. Good question.
It highlights this fundamental tension, right, between the claims of divinity and the earthly reality of Jesus' life and crucifixion. It's a puzzle people kept wrestling with.
And wasn't just Celso, you mentioned Porphyry, too.
Yeah, we have fragments of his criticisms as well. And then shifting to Jewish perspectives, there's the Sefer Toldot Yeshu.
The Book of the Generations of Jesus.
Right, which offered alternative, sometimes quite satirical, accounts of Jesus' life.
Satirical. Interesting.
And the impact of that text is pretty remarkable. Your sources mention that even Enlightenment figures like Voltaire apparently found it more plausible than the canonical Gospels.
Wow, so there's this continuous sort of underground stream of alternative narratives.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just folklore or satire. You had serious scholars weighing in. In the 10th century, the Karaite scholar Jacob Kirkasani.
In his Book of Lights.
Yes. He argued that Paul and, interestingly, Constantine were the real architects of Christianity as we know it.
That's quite a claim for the 10th century.
It really is. And jump forward a few hundred years, 16th century, Isaac ben Abraham of Troki. His work, Fortification of the Faith, portrayed Jesus essentially as a Jewish teacher.
Just reinterpreting the Torah?
Pretty much. Offering his own take within Judaism. This really foreshadows later approaches that heavily emphasize Jesus' Jewish roots.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Martin Seidel, also 16th century. Your sources flag him as making a key shift.
Yes, Seidel's important. He started grounding Jesus much more firmly in the specific political and social context of first century Palestine.
How did that change things?
He looked at the crucifixion through a political lens. He saw it as having political motivations, not just purely religious ones.
So moving away from just theology.
Exactly. By placing Jesus within the political tensions and aspirations of his time, Seidel was really anticipating the kind of analysis many later scholars, including Bermejo-Rubio, would adopt.
And then Leone Modena in the 17th century. His angle was different again?
Modena focused on the sheer implausibility, from a Jewish perspective, of Jesus completely breaking away from the Torah.
Why implausible?
Well, he argued that such a radical break within Judaism would have been so disruptive, it would have made it almost impossible for Jesus to gain any significant Jewish following.
Makes sense.
So, Modena suggested it was more likely that Jesus was proposing a reinterpretation of the law, working within the existing Jewish framework.
Okay, so all this groundwork was laid before the Enlightenment, which is where many people think the story begins. Let's dive into that period now. The rise of rationalism.
Right. And you see this clearly with British deism, thinkers like John Toland.
What characterized the deist approach?
A huge emphasis on reason. Using reason to understand religion and critically examining the Christian sources. Toland, for instance, got interested in the Gospel of Barnabas and the Nazarenes, or Ebionites.
Why them?
He saw them as potentially representing a more authentic, maybe an earlier version of Christianity before Pauline theology became dominant, kind of like searching for the original faith.
Interesting. And then across the channel, in France, you had thinkers like D'Holbach.
Yes, the French freethinkers often took an even more radical stance. D'Holbach, for example, didn't really see Jesus as a religious figure primarily.
How did he see him?
More as a political motivated figure, a kind of liberator for an oppressed people. Again, maybe not rigorous history by today's standards, but it shows that growing interest in the political context.
Which brings us squarely to Hermann Samuel Reimarus. The sources really mark him as a turning point.
Definitely a pivotal figure.
He seems to be the one who really drove a wedge between the Jesus of history, the one we might be able to reconstruct, and the Christ of faith.
Absolutely. That separation is key to almost everything that follows. Reimarus put forward some incredibly provocative ideas for his time.
Like the idea about the disciples.
Yes, his argument that the disciples actually stole Jesus's body and essentially invented the resurrection story to keep the movement going.
Wow, that's bold.
Extremely. And he didn't see Jesus as primarily spiritual. He saw the historical Jesus as a Jewish leader with clear political messianic aims, trying to restore Israel.
So the failure of those political goals led to a theological reinterpretation later. That was his argument.
Precisely. The shift to a spiritual savior came after the political project failed, in Reimarus's view.
But perhaps even more important than his conclusions, however controversial, was his method.
Right.
He tried to establish criteria for evaluating the Gospels.
That's the crucial point. He was pioneering historical methodology for biblical texts. He used what we now recognize as early versions of historical criteria.
Like the criterion of embarrassment.
Exactly. Looking for things in the Gospels that the early church probably wouldn't have invented because they were, well, embarrassing or problematic. He also looked for what he called vestiges of an older system, hints of that original political Messiah figure, even underneath the later theology. And he used reductio ad absurdum, trying to point out internal contradictions.
So he really laid the foundations for critical analysis.
He absolutely did. Even if his conclusions were radical, his attempt at methodology was groundbreaking.
Okay. After Reimarus, you have figures influenced by German idealism, like Feuerbach.
Yeah.
How do they fit in?
Well, the sources suggest their interpretations were often heavily filtered through their own philosophical systems.
So less about the historical context, more about their own ideas.
Sometimes, yes. Whether they were rationalists or idealists, they sometimes projected their own concerns onto Jesus, leading to interpretations maybe a bit detached from first-century Palestine.
Right. And this whole period from the Enlightenment through Reimarus and up to the early 20th century, this is the Old Quest.
That's the term, yeah, the Old Quest. And its defining feature was this sort of optimism, a belief that through critical source analysis, you could actually reconstruct a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus.
But that optimism hit a wall, didn't it, with Rudolf Bultmann?
A massive wall. Bultmann introduced a profound skepticism about accessing the historical Jesus at all. His key idea was demythologization.
Demythologization. Explain that a bit.
Bultmann argued that the Gospels aren't primarily historical records of Jesus' life. They are primarily kerygma, the preaching, the proclamation of the early church about Jesus.
So shaped by later belief.
Heavily shaped. So much so, Bultmann believed that the original historical figure was essentially buried under layers of interpretation and theology. Almost irretrievable.
Like trying to unscramble an egg.
Kind of, yeah. He wasn't the first to think along these lines. David Friedrich Strauss had already talked about myth in the Gospels, and Martin Kahler had stressed how few reliable historical sources we actually have.
So for Bultmann, what mattered wasn't historical facts about Jesus.
No, what mattered was faith in the message, the kerygma, the proclamation of salvation offered by the early church. Historical certainty wasn't necessary for salvation, in his view.
And demythologization was about translating the Bible's language for modern times.
Exactly. He saw the New Testament's worldview, miracles, demons, a three-tiered universe, as mythological, basically unintelligible to modern people.
So he wanted to reinterpret it.
Yes, reinterpret that mythological language to uncover the underlying existential meaning. What does this story say about human existence, decision, authentic life, encountering God? That was his focus.
And he also saw Paul as playing a big role in Hellenizing the message, moving it away from its Jewish roots.
He did. He thought Paul was key in translating Jesus' message into Greek philosophical categories, which, for Bultmann, further obscured the original historical figure and his Jewish context.
So Bultmann basically said, forget trying to find the historical Jesus, focus on the theological message, but people pushed back against that level of skepticism.
He did. That led to what's called the New Quest.
The New Quest.
This was a reaction mainly by Bultmann's own students, like Ernst Käsemann and Gunther Bornkamm. They weren't quite ready to give up on the historical Jesus entirely.
They thought maybe some things could be recovered.
Exactly. They wanted to see if they could identify at least some core features of the historical Jesus that shone through the early church's preaching, the kerygma.
And Käsemann developed a specific tool for this, the criterion of dissimilarity.
Yes, the criterion of dissimilarity or discontinuity. It's an interesting idea.
How does it work?
The logic is, if a saying or action attributed to Jesus is unlike both the typical Judaism of his time and unlike the beliefs of the early church that recorded it, then it's more likely to be authentic.
Because neither group would likely have invented it.
That's the thinking. It stands out as unique to Jesus. But, as your sources note, there's a big danger here.
Which is?
If you apply it too rigidly, you end up isolating Jesus completely from his own Jewish environment and from the movement he inspired. You risk creating a Jesus who doesn't fit anywhere, which is historically problematic.
Right, that makes sense. Which leads us naturally into the third quest.
Indeed. The third quest, which gained momentum from the latter half of the 20th century, really shifted the focus back squarely onto Jesus' Jewishness.
But wasn't it always known he was Jewish?
Of course, but the third quest made understanding him within first-century Palestinian Judaism the absolute central task. It wasn't just a background detail, it was the interpretive key.
So really digging into the different Jewish groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots.
Exactly. Trying to understand the diverse religious, cultural, political landscape he inhabited. Where did his teachings fit? How did they relate to Jewish prophetic traditions, apocalyptic hopes, interpretations of the law?
Seeing his emphasis on mercy and inner purity as ways of fulfilling the law, not rejecting it.
Precisely. And this quest also broadened the source material dramatically.
Beyond just the Gospels.
Way beyond. Scholars started seriously engaging with Jewish intertestamental literature, rabbinic writings, Hellenistic sources, other early Christian texts outside the canon, like the Gospel of Thomas.
Agrapha, apocryphal Gospels.
Yes. And archaeology started playing a much bigger role, too, giving us a tangible feel for daily life, social structures, the political realities in Galilee and Judea.
And even bringing in sociology and anthropology.
Right. Applying social science models to understand the economics, politics, and religious dynamics at the time, it created a much richer, more textured picture.
And Jewish scholars themselves played a huge role here.
Absolutely crucial. Figures like Klausner, Ben-Chorin, David Flusser, Geza Vermes, their work was fundamental in firmly placing Jesus within the vibrant, complex world of first-century Judaism.
Okay, this detailed Jewish context seems vital. Now let's bring in Fernando Bermejo-Rubio. Your sources frame his work as a kind of new paradigm. What's the core idea?
A central argument for Bermejo-Rubio is that even within academic scholarship, let alone popular understanding, there are still persistent fictitious elements shaping how we see Jesus. He calls for extreme rigor.
What does that rigor look like?
Well, first, he rejects any idea that Jesus requires a special methodology. He argues we should apply the exact same critical historical methods we'd use for any other figure from antiquity. No special pleading.
Yeah.
He calls his approach historical minimalism. It means scrutinizing all sources intensely without assuming historicity up front.
Does he think Jesus existed?
Yes, he concludes that Jesus' existence is still the most probable hypothesis based on the evidence, but he arrives there through rigorous questioning, not assumption. It's like starting from scratch with the evidence.
And he's critical of the traditional sources, like Paul's letters and the Gospels.
Very critical. He views them primarily as theological documents reflecting the beliefs of later communities, not as straightforward historical accounts of Jesus' life.
What about the criteria of authenticity, like dissimilarity or embarrassment, that the new quests use?
He's skeptical of them as definitive proofs. He sees them more as potentially useful indices or indicators of what he calls counter-discursive material. Material that seems to go against the main message or agenda of the gospel writer. His thinking is, why would they invent something that potentially undermines their own point? So, such details might have a historical root, but it's not proof.
Okay. Now, one of his major hypotheses concerns the crucifixion. He links it directly to anti-Roman sentiment.
Yes. He argues that the most plausible historical reason for the Romans to execute Jesus by crucifixion, a punishment often used for sedition, was that there was an openly anti-Roman dimension to his message or actions.
But if that's the case, why isn't it more explicit in the Gospels?
Bermejo-Rubio suggests this comes down to the survival instinct of the early Christian community.
How so?
Directly linking their founder to anti-Roman activity would have been incredibly dangerous under Roman rule. It could have invited severe persecution. So, he argues, the gospel writers downplayed or veiled this aspect for self-preservation.
So he sees Jesus less as purely spiritual, more as an apocalyptic visionary with political implications?
Exactly. Someone proclaiming God's imminent kingdom in a way that implicitly and perhaps sometimes explicitly challenged Roman authority and maybe had regio-messianic claims.
Even the render unto Caesar saying. He interprets that differently.
He does. He suggests it might not have been about submission, but actually a subtle form of resistance. The underlying message, perhaps, being that since everything ultimately belongs to God, what truly belongs to Caesar is nothing of ultimate importance.
That's a twist.
It's a rereading that fits his political interpretation.
And the fact that Jesus was crucified with bandits, as the Gospels say.
Bermejo-Rubio emphasizes that bandits, or lestai in Greek, in that Roman context, was often a label for rebels, insurgents, those involved in anti-Roman resistance.
So being crucified alongside them suggests Jesus was perceived by the Romans in a similar light.
That's his argument. It points towards a political dimension to his execution that theological interpretations often miss or downplay.
He also talks about how the followers reinterpreted Jesus after the crucifixion, using psychology.
Yes, he brings in concepts like cognitive dissonance, collective grief, selective memory, and what he calls a Jurassic hermeneutic.
Jurassic hermeneutic.
It's about rereading existing scriptures, in this case, the Hebrew Bible, to find new meaning in light of traumatic or unexpected events, like the crucifixion of their leader, finding prophecies that seem to explain what happened.
So they reframed the story using scripture.
That's a key part of his explanation for how the figure of Jesus was transformed after his death. He also stresses understanding the wider cultural context, Jewish and Greco-Roman, for how deification could even happen.
Arguing that a human becoming divine wasn't a totally alien concept back then.
Right. He points to traditions like the near sacrifice of Isaac, Yom Kippur atonement rituals, and Greco-Roman ideas about divinized heroes or emperors. He suggests the boundaries weren't as rigid as we might assume, even challenging the idea of a strict, monolithic monotheism in all forms of first-century Judaism.
And he constantly circles back to Jesus' fundamental Jewishness.
Absolutely. He critiques any tendency to Christianize Jesus by removing him from that context, pointing to the most extreme distortion, the Nazi attempt to make Jesus an Aryan.
Wow.
He sees erasing the Jewishness as a form of historiographical fiction, often driven by ideology. He's also critical of neat historical schemes, like the three quest model, arguing for a more consistently critical approach, less shaped by prior assumptions.
Okay, so it's a very rigorous, critical, context-focused approach. How's it been received academically?
Generally quite positively, according to your sources. Even within Catholic academic circles, there seems to be an appreciation for the rigor and the systematic framework he provides.
What are the key takeaways reviewers noted?
Things like his thorough analysis of the mythicist arguments, those who claim Jesus never existed, his focus on the political dimension of the crucifixion, seeing Jesus as this visionary with anti-Roman implications, using psychological concepts, and strongly grounding everything in the cultural context. Many seem to feel it's a valuable systematic contribution.
What about outside academia? Journalistic reception?
There, the focus tended to be on the more accessible, maybe headline-grabbing aspects, like the idea that the image of a purely pacifist Jesus might be an invention,
Or sensationalized.
perhaps simplified. Some commentators also expressed reservations, maybe feeling he separated Jesus too much from his followers, or critiquing his sometimes harsh judgment on more theologically oriented scholars. A bit of pushback on the more radical conclusions.
And social media. Predictably polarized.
Very much so. Your sources describe reactions ranging from real intellectual engagement to, well, strong resistance and dismissal, often tied to people's cultural or religious identities.
So a real split between critical historical views and more devotional perspectives.
Definitely. His work clearly hit a nerve, highlighting that ongoing tension between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith in the public square.
So we've traced this long, winding path. From early critics centuries ago, through the Enlightenment quests, Bultmann's skepticism, the rediscovery of Jewishness, right up to Bermejo-Rubio's demanding new paradigm. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And it shows how the quest for the historical Jesus often reveals as much about the time and perspective of the researchers as it does about Jesus himself.
It reminds me of that quote from Maru you mentioned earlier, about 150 years of effort yielding. Not that much certainty. That sense of irony.
Yes, Jesus existed, he died, and was believed to be resurrected, and that's more or less all. It does highlight the inherent difficulties and the limits of historical reconstruction with this kind of evidence.
Yeah. But maybe looking at it another way. Perhaps the fact that this inquiry continues, that the figure is constantly being re-examined, reinterpreted across vastly different eras, maybe that itself speaks to the enduring power or resonance of his message.
That's certainly another perspective,
Yeah.
that the ongoing debate reflects the figure's lasting impact.
It leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. Does this whole complex, often fragmented search for the historical Jesus, with all its uncertainties and shifting interpretations, does it, in a way, mirror the complexity and maybe fragmentation of our own postmodern times? Does it echo that fundamental question, what is man?